Okay, so as an exercise in being fair-minded, let me try and put forward my best possible interpretation of how the decriminalisation of prostitution might work out in New Zealand. Then I'm going to explain why I don't think even that would be a desirable outcome. But by way of playing devil's advocate, this is me taking my best shot at advocating a viable version of decriminalisation, or decrim. Firstly, like all versions of decrim, I'm going to include an element of legal sanction, although in this case it's legally enforceable regulations rather than criminal law. So there would be state-regulated brothels, with the aim being to accommodate the supposed needs of the non-gonzo punters, by which I mean the ones who are willing to accept the sort of sterile regime which could maybe make paid sex less traumatic. So that would basically involve the punters being processed like so many frozen chickens and just allowed to jack off into whatever orifice the woman agrees to make available. To which you might say there aren't many men who'd pay for something like that, given that it's got very little to do with real sex. But if you compare it to what they get when they go in a lap dancing club, it's not that different. So anyway, there would also be start-up grants and financial advice to help the sex workers form their own small owner-operated brothels, or SOOBs, as they're known in New Zealand, complete with potted plants, etc. And there'd be inspectors who were ex-sex workers employed to conduct regular one-to-one interviews with the women working at these brothels as a way to uncover any abuse. And okay, I can't help pointing out that this would involve shed loads of resources and a whole legion of well-trained professionals, which, when you think how badly America treats even its war veterans, does seem a bit implausible. But anyway, let's carry on. So I'm going to assume that 50% of the punters would transfer their custom to these state-run brothels. Then the pimps catering for the remaining 50% would be illegal, or at least in breach of the regulations on how to run a brothel. So they could be pursued in the same way Sweden does, i.e. while keeping the sex providers, and in this case the punters, decriminalised. In other words, decrim is really a form of legalisation, except that they're hoping the barracks-like atmosphere of the state-run brothels would gradually be replaced by the self-employed ethos of a growing number of SOOBs. So okay, let's have a look at what advantages this combination of legalisation light with a punter-friendly version of the Swedish model might have, compared to a fully fledged Swedish model. Well, one idea is that siphoning off 50% of the underground pimp's customers would reduce their cash flow and so make them easy to pursue. And those sex providers who did manage to set themselves up in SOOBs would have escaped some of the violence associated with the sex industry, e.g. not being beaten up and ripped off by their pimps, and maybe less overt violence from their punters. Also, if you think it really is a basic human right to sell yourself as a sex object, well, this system would preserve that for you. Equally, to whatever extent you think we're at risk of the government taking over our lives, this would give a bit of pushback to that. So okay, what about the disadvantages? Except that before I get on to all that, I should point out that this ideal system is nothing like the reality of New Zealand since 2003. I've put some links in the lower bar, but basically decrim has meant adopting a free market fundamentalist approach. So all the regulations are as minimal as possible, and even the standards which do exist are not backed up by inspections, to the extent that when they register a brothel owner, they don't even ask him for a list of addresses for his brothel. In fact, there's even talk of stopping the requirement that brothel owners can't have a criminal record, on the basis that it's discrimination, because it isn't a requirement for any other normal enterprise. Oh, and also there hasn't been an increase in the number of SOOBs, or a decrease in the number of people working the streets. Still, bearing all that in mind, let's get back to the ideal world version of a well-regulated but decriminalised regime, and look at its disadvantages. Well, whatever disadvantages the Swedish model has, this regime will have most of them too for the 50% of punters who don't use estate brothels. But this regime, unlike Sweden, would massively normalise the idea that being bought as a sex object was a perfectly good job for some people. And personally, I don't know how we would be expected to explain to our children that the women working at that house on the corner pay their bills by letting total strangers poke various parts of their bodies. Also, normalisation would lead to an expansion of the sex industry, with no 18th birthday being complete without a visit to the state brothel. Plus, women could be moved between the regulated and non-regulated brothels, which is just one reason why the growth of the legal sector would help to make the illegal sector more viable. Also, those running non-regulated brothels would only be breaking regulations, not statutory law, so the available sanctions for eliminating the underground sector would be a lot less than those available in Sweden. For example, in Sweden a pimp can get 4 years in prison, whereas in New Zealand the maximum penalty for running an unregistered brothel is a fine. And in reality those regulations tend to focus on the impact a brothel might have on the surrounding areas, more than on what goes on behind closed doors. Then finally, as I say, the resources needed to effectively manage state-regulated brothels so that the experience of being used as a sex object really could be converted into some kind of clinically detached, safe, and ultimately harm-free activity would be enormous. Equally, the resources needed to help get a reasonable number of subs off the ground wouldn't come cheap. But really, all these skills and resources used to achieve what? A society which defends as a supposed human right women's ability to pay the bills by being used as a sex object. A society which, for men, guarantees access to female flesh on demand. So even if it did work, what a truly dismal dystopia that would be. A bit like that film Stepford Wives, where all the women are disturbingly submissive and compliant, except this version would be X-rated. So imagine that world, and then imagine what we could achieve with the same level of investment in any one of 100 genuinely worthwhile projects.